What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 11 updated top 40 wide receiver rankings. So just updating these after the Thursday night game, adding some players on from the ones I did earlier in the week. If you guys enjoyed the video, smash that like button and subscribe. But let's dive into tier 1 here. I have a top 3. It's Jamar Chase, Nico Collins, Justin Jefferson. If Nico Collins is back from that hamstring injury, obviously we know these other two, are studs. They're all going to be locked into your fantasy football lineup. Then looking at tier 2, going to start it off with George Pickens. He has been on an absolute tear ever since Russ has taken over. 5 for 111 and a touchdown, 4 for 74, 5 for 91 and a touchdown. And then he just draws a great matchup here. The Ravens have allowed by far and away the most points per game to the wide receiver position. So Pickens has been balling. Plus, he has a really strong matchup. Then after Pickens, I'm going to be going with the two Rams wide receivers, Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp. I think they're both studs going up against the Patriots here. Definitely belong in tier 2. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown. The Lions are number 1 in implied points. The Jaguars are allowing the 6th most points per game to the wide receiver position. My only concern, and I guess it's somewhat of a minor concern, is that we have seen in some of these blowouts, the passing volume for the Lions is just very, very low. So that's the concern. There's just not going to be a ton of volume to go around, but he's going to have touchdown upside. They're going to put up a lot of points. He's obviously still going to be locked in your lineup. Now looking at tier 3, going to start off this tier with Tyreek Hill. And I feel like this is where the wide receiver position starts to not feel great. Not that these guys aren't startable, but I just feel like in recent years, this like fringe back end wide receiver 1 area felt really, really strong. I don't think it has that same feel this year. I mean, starting off with a guy like Tyreek Hill here, he has just not been all that great, even with Tua back, like 15.7 points per game, but the last 3 have been somewhat underwhelming. He's only hit 14 plus points one time. So you still think he can turn it around, but like the 4 games we've seen with Tua haven't been all that great. Then we have Garrett Wilson going up against the Colts. He's been pretty solid with Devontae Adams on the Jets, 13.1, 16.3, 30, and 9.1 PPR points. Then I have DK Metcalf, expecting him to make his return here from the knee injury. I do think coming off the bye week is going to help him out. Hopefully gave him an extra week to come back. And I think he'll produce in like this fringe back-end wide receiver 1 area this week. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Zay Flowers. Kind of a tough guy to gauge because he just has these like super fun boom weeks with 100 plus receiving yards, and then he'll just have like a complete floor game. So he is fairly boomer bust, but his ceiling is pretty high, 5 games above 18 points. So I do think he belongs in this range, but he's definitely not the most like stable high floor play that you are going to find. Now moving into tier 4, going to start off this tier with CeeDee Lamb. And I think some people out there think CeeDee Lamb is just completely toast rest of season with no Dak. I disagree with that. Obviously last week was not great, like 10 targets, 6 for 21. Cooper Rush's passing stat line was like awful, but this is still CeeDee Lamb here. It's a pretty solid matchup here against the Texans. They are top 7 in points per game allowed. And even when we look back, I think it was 2 years ago, 2022, we had like a 5-6 game sample size with no Dak, and CeeDee Lamb was still averaging like 16 plus points per game. Now, that was a better looking Cowboys offense before the Dak injury, so obviously not like apples to apples, but I still think CeeDee Lamb will be fine rest of season, and I still think he is playable this week. Then I have Deebo Samuel going up against the Seahawks. It's a nice matchup here. 49ers are going to put up points. Deebo's their wide receiver 1. Then I have Drake London and Darnell Mooney within this tier. I think it'll be interesting to see who draws the Surtain matchup. London does kind of mix into the slot, which I guess makes me feel a little bit better about him, but I would imagine that when he's on the outside, he would be drawing that Surtain matchup, which could potentially give a boost to Darnell Mooney, who's averaging 14.4 points per game on the season. Then between those two, I have Courtland Sutton and Jaden Reed. Courtland Sutton has been on a run here. His last 3 games, he's gone 8 for 100, 7 for 122, 6 for 70, and a touchdown. And the Falcons are top 10 in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. Seems like a great spot for Sutton. And then for Jaden Reed, he has just been very productive with Jordan Love at quarterback, 18 PPR points per game. Now, it's not a great matchup here against the Bears, and I will say he kind of front-loaded those big games with Jordan Love. Hasn't been like these crazy ceiling performances since then, but still on the season with Love at quarterback, in his healthy games, Jaden Reed has been a very nice play. Now, moving into tier 5, kind of an interesting, fun tier here. Going to start it off with Cedric Tillman going up against the Saints. he has really just come out of nowhere. Jameis Winston's taken over at quarterback, and he goes 8 for 81, 7 for 99 and 2 touchdowns, and then 6 for 75 and a touchdown. Now, is this sustainable? I don't know. It's kind of odd that you have, just this young wide receiver rotting on your bench, barely getting in, and then all of a sudden he gets his opportunity and he's amazing. So I think he's clearly flashing that he is talented. I don't think he's going to replicate what we've seen through 3 weeks, but I definitely think he can be a playable option, and I have him as a wide receiver 2 this week. Then I have Calvin Ridley, has really kind of had his season revitalized over the last few games. In his last 3, he has put up 22.6, 12.3, and 25.4 PPR points. Now, this is something I mentioned in the earlier in the week rankings video. It's this interesting spot with Calvin Ridley where the Vikings defense has given, opposing quarterbacks a lot of problems. They've forced turnovers. They've, forced a lot of sacks, but they've actually been giving a fair amount of points up to the wide receiver position. They're allowing the 3rd most points per game to the wide receiver spot. My concern with Ridley is that even though on paper it's a good matchup, I could see this Vikings defense just completely overwhelming Will Levis. And so, maybe they're not even getting, those garbage time passing yards because, the passing attack is just so, out of sorts. I do think there's potential for that, but like I said, on paper, it does look like a decent matchup here, and Calvin Ridley has been very impressive getting force-fed over the last few weeks. Then up next, as my wide receiver 20, I have T. Higgins going up against the Chargers. Now, there's no guarantee he plays this week. He has logged back-to-back limited practices, but it's kind of like this middle ground ranking because if he was healthy, with what we saw early on in the season, he would probably be in that tier 3 area. He has been super productive when he has been out on the field, but he also has this injury history of going into games, being listed as active when he comes in injured and then barely playing or not playing at all. So that's the concern here is that they say, all right, T. Higgins is active, he's going to play, and then he plays 10% of the snaps, runs a few routes, and that's it. That's the concern. It's kind of just a risk you have to be willing to weigh, and then obviously just be monitoring the injury reports leading up to his game. But after Higgins, going to go with Jacoby Myers going up against the Dolphins. It's a bad matchup. They're bottom 6 in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. But ever since Davante Adams has left, Jacoby Myers has been balling 16.4 points per game in his last 5, almost averaging 10 targets per game. Then that guy who did leave, Davante Adams, going up against the Colts. I have seen some people who thought I had Davante ranked too low in my last set of rankings, and I guess I just struggled to rank him any higher when he really has not produced with the Jets. He had the one nice game, I think it was week 9, but in 3 of his 4 matchups, he has put up under 10 PPR points. This Jets offense isn't giving me a ton of confidence that they've turned some corner or are about to turn some corner, so it's really tough for me to rank Adams any higher than where I have him right now is a back-end wide receiver 2 play. After Adams, I have another veteran wide receiver here in DeAndre Hopkins going up against the Bills. It's not a great matchup here against the Bills. He was fine last week in a pretty tough matchup. Chiefs are actually underdogs in this one. I think, we saw the one huge game from D-Hop. I think it'll be interesting to see where he kind of settles in. I'm not super locked in that he's going to be a high-end wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1 rest of season. I do think this game will be fairly telling on, what his fantasy upside is going to be moving forward. Then I have Khalil Shakir going up against the Chiefs in that same matchup. Definitely a different type of player than D-Hop, more of a very high floor, low ceiling option, consistently hitting double-digit PPR points, but not really, breaking into that 20-plus area. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Ladd McConkey. Fine with the matchup. I think Chargers are actually favored in this one. Talented young player. I still think he can put some big games together down the stretch. Now, moving into tier 6, going to start off this tier with Josh Downs. Now, he's definitely someone who took a hit with the news that Anthony Richardson would be taking back over. We have seen 3 games that Josh Downs has played with Richardson as the starter. He has put up 5.2, 1.3, and 22.2 PPR points. It's also just a bad matchup here going up against the Jets. They've allowed the fewest points per game to the wide receiver position. So you have the 3 games. The production wasn't great. It's also a really tough matchup. I'm not saying he won't or can't be relevant with Richardson at quarterback, but I do just think for this specific week, I'd like to see him go out there, have a solid game before I play him over some of these dudes ranked ahead of him. After Downs, going to go with Jawan Jennings going up against the Seahawks. Honestly, this 49ers wide receiver room, I just think is really interesting. With no Brandon Ayuk, you have Debo, who is pretty established. You have Jawan Jennings, who's now really getting like some real run as a starting wide receiver. And then you have Ricky Pearsall, who looks like a fun addition. So I'm kind of just interested to see how these like wide receivers play out rest of season. But I do think Jawan Jennings is a fine play. Then I have JSN going up against the Niners. Obviously, this is with the assumption that DK Metcalf is back. JSN before the bye week had like that nuclear game. I imagine he kind of settles back into the role and production he had, before the DK Metcalf injury. Then I have Tank Dell going up against the Cowboys. I really like Tank Dell heading into the season. It has not panned out. I think the hope here, and maybe this is just me coping, is that Nico Collins, you get him back in there. Stephon Diggs out for the season. We have that sample size last year where Nico Collins, Tank Dell, healthy games where they're playing together as the starters. Both were super productive. Tank Dell actually averaged more points per game than Nico Collins. I'm definitely not saying that is going to happen, but I think you're just hoping they can return to that, or Tank Dell can return to that, where he's giving you that nice, consistent production for the fantasy wide receiver position. Then I'm going to go with Amari Cooper going up against the Chiefs. There's no guarantee he plays this week with that wrist injury. Seemed like he said that he was like leaning towards playing, or he really wanted to play. We know we're not getting Keon Coleman this week, so I think that could be a spot where if Cooper does play, maybe he's finally like launched into that full, starting wide receiver usage, which we just haven't seen yet. If he doesn't play, obviously, just scratch him from these rankings. Then I have JMO going up against the Jaguars. I like the matchup here, 6th in points per game allowed. And I think JMO's in an interesting spot where I talked about the concern with the passing volume for Amon-Ra St. Brown. JMO's kind of in like a different bucket because he is not someone who relies on volume. He is like a big play touchdown threat. So the low volume doesn't scare me quite as much with JMO because he can really like make your fantasy day on one play, right? He rips off a 60-yard touchdown, like that's pretty much set in your fantasy lineup. Then I'm going to go with another wide receiver in that same matchup. It is going to be Brian Thomas Jr., and it sucks to have him ranked this low. I really liked him heading into the season. He was balling out. I thought he could be a potential league winner, over the rest of the season with Trevor Lawrence. But man, like the Trevor Lawrence to Mac Jones switch is looking brutal. His first game with Mac, he's going 2 for 12, only commanding 3 targets. It is a favorable matchup, which I guess, could make me a little bit interested. 2nd in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position, but vibes are definitely down on BTJ here, and it's really not his fault, just like the quarterback shakeup. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Jerry Jeudy going up against the Saints. In his last 2 games, he has gone 5 for 79 and 11 for 73, going up against this Colts secondary that just lost Marshawn Lattimore. And then the final tier here, tier 7, I guess these guys could be playable if you're desperate. You have guys on bye, injuries, it happens. Going to start off here with DJ Moore, and Moore has been awful. Under 8 PPR points in each of his last 4 games. The hope here is that the offensive coordinator shakeup, kind of can open some things up here for DJ Moore. Maybe they start to turn it around. Then I have Ricky Pearsall going up against the Seahawks, coming off his best game of the season, only his 3rd game. Week 10, 4 for 73 and a touchdown. Like I kind of talked about with Jawan Jennings, he's working his way into this offense. He's had back-to-back productive games. He's a big play guy. I think he'll be fun to watch rest of season. Then I have Romeo Doubs going up against the Bears. Ever since he got suspended and then has come back, he has been a really nice option. It is a tough matchup here against the Bears, though. They have allowed the 2nd fewest points per game to the wide receiver position. Then I have Quentin Johnston going up against the Bengals. He's really kind of emerged as like a touchdown threat. 5 touchdowns in his 7 games. At this point with these wide receivers, like the volume doesn't seem super secure. So if you do have someone with that touchdown upside, could make them playable. Then I have Jalen Waddle going up against the Raiders. If you would have told me that Week 11 with bye weeks, lots of injuries to the wide receiver position, with a healthy Tua, that I'd be ranking Jalen Waddle as a wide receiver 4. I would have told you he lost a leg or something. Waddle in this situation should be at worst a fantasy wide receiver 2, especially this week. But he has just been completely abysmal since week 1. Less than 10 PPR points in every single game since week 1. And at a certain point, we can't keep saying, or I can't keep saying well, the talent's there. He's produced in previous seasons. It is not happening this season. I would like to see a turnaround at some point. I wouldn't be shocked if there was a turnaround, but at this point, maybe I should have him lower. You guys might want him lower than Demario Douglas. and Rashad Bateman, and I would not blame you. But after Waddle, like I said, going to go with Demario Douglas here. 3 games with Drake May as like the healthy quarterback, 21.2, 10.5, 9 PPR points. And then Rashad Bateman here coming off, one of his best games of the season, 6 for 54 and a touchdown, tied his season lead in targets, and was his season high in receptions. He's averaging 10.5 PPR points per game. Fun to see Bateman getting involved. Could do worse in your like wide receiver 4 flex spot. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 40 wide receiver rankings for week 11. Any questions, drop them down below. Thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.